The winter of 1945 settled over Europe like a heavy, unspoken verdict. Cities lay in ruins. Rail lines twisted across the landscape like broken ribs. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the charred skeleton of a continent that had burned for 6 years, a different kind of danger gathered, quiet, calculated, and born not from the trenches but from the minds of two men who had inherited the world's fate. One of them sat in the Kremlin, watching his empire stretch like a wounded but restless creature toward the west. Joseph Stalin, the man who had outlasted purges, famines, assassins, and Hitler himself, now stared at maps crowded with red banners marking Soviet armies from the Elbe to the Pacific. Victory had not softened him, it had emboldened him. He believed history owed him more territory influence, obedience paid for in the blood of 30 million of his own people. The other man sat oceans away in a small, lamplit room in the White House, a place he still felt he had entered through a door he was never meant to touch. Harry Truman had been president for only a few weeks when he learned that he now commanded a weapon capable of unmaking cities in a single sunrise. He had inherited not just a war, but a secret that rearranged the world's balance of fear. And he understood something that Stalin did not. That power, if not checked early, expands like a shadow at dusk, quietly, confidently, until it owns the entire horizon. The clash between these two men began not with bombs or armies, but with a question whispered across Europe: who would shape the peace? The war was ending, but the peace was already beginning to fracture. In the spring of 45, Berlin was a carcass divided by victors who barely trusted one another. The Soviet flag whipped above the Reichstag, torn by wind that carried the stale scent of ash. American and British officers walked streets where silence felt staged ads. If the city itself held its breath while the Allies eyed each other over the rubble, tanks still idled in intersections. Soldiers gathered at checkpoints with uneasy glances. No one dared relax. The war had ended, but nothing felt resolved. Truman had stepped into office expecting alliance. What he found instead were cables speaking of Soviet troops refusing access to Allied officers, of trainloads of German engineers and scientists spirited east under guard, of a Soviet grip tightening around Eastern Europe. In town after town, local councils that had barely survived Nazi rule were brushed aside for committees loyal to Moscow, their signatures inked before the people even knew a new government existed. Stalin believed the West would grumble, maybe protest diplomatically, but ultimately accept the reality imposed by the Red Army's presence. The Soviets had bled the most. They had earned their sphere of influence. And if Stalin wanted Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, he wanted a buffer zone of obedience to shield Russia from another invasion who could stop him. For weeks, Truman received reports that felt like warnings written between the lines. Allied reconnaissance flights near the Elbe reported Soviet searchlights rising from forest clearings, sweeping the sky with deliberate aggression as if mapping the boundaries of a new empire. British intelligence noted the disappearance of moderate leaders in Warsaw who had once negotiated with London. And deep inside the ruins of Berlin, an American patrol was turned back by Soviet guards who claimed, without explanation, that the road ahead was now under the jurisdiction of Moscow. The tone chilled Truman more than any communication. He read them late into the night, often alone. The glow of the desk lamp carving long shadows across stacks of briefing papers. One aide later recalled that Truman never raised his voice, never paced or ranted. He simply reads, low, focused, each detail sinking into him like a weight he could not set down. He understood something was building in Europe, something that could not be undone by polite notes and diplomatic patience. The moment of decision arrived during a closed-door meeting in Potsdam, held in a house whose windows rattled whenever a distant demolition charge went off. Stalin sat across from Truman with the calm of a man who believed he had already shaped tomorrow. His eyes moved seldom, his hands even less. Every sentence from him felt pre-measured, as if he had practiced the pauses as carefully as the words. To Truman's surprise, Stalin spoke as if Eastern Europe were already settled, its governments, its borders Soviet-lined, its future Soviet. He spoke of Germany's division as though it were fact, not negotiation. He spoke of influence like a man reading inventory. And he spoke with the assurance that America, exhausted and longing for home, would concede. But Truman did not concede. He had promised himself weeks earlier, standing alone in the map room, that he would not watch the peace be carved up like a carcass simply because the world was too tired to resist. And he had something he believed Stalin underestimated: the quiet momentum of American resolve, and a weapon that shifted the axis of global fear. Truman leaned forward slightly. The gesture was almost imperceptible, but the room seemed to still around it. He spoke calmly, without rhetoric, without threat. Yet every man present felt the shift. Truman was no longer the uncertain successor. He was a man drawing a line. The details were never made public. No transcript captured the exact sequence. But those who witnessed it described a moment when the air changed, when Stalin's expression, usually fixed like carved stone, tightened ever so slightly. Truman had made it clear that American withdrawal from Europe was not imminent, that Soviet expansion would not go unchallenged, and that the United States possessed capabilities Stalin did not yet fully grasp. It was the first time someone had told Stalin no, and meant it. Outside, beyond the guarded windows, the evening lights stretched long across the ruins of Potsdam. Soldiers moved quietly between vehicles. The smell of dust and newly disturbed earth hung in the stillness. A crow settled on the broken wall of a nearby building, its silhouette sharp against the fading sky. Everything felt paused, held between the memory of war and the uncertainty of peace. Stalin left the meeting saying little, but his silence carried more weight than any statement. His advisors noted the unusual quiet, his stride longer, his eyes fixed ahead instead of surveying the room, as he normally did. Something had not gone as planned. In Moscow, the first hints of his recalibration appeared days later: a softening tone in cables, sudden delays in the formation of certain Eastern European committees, reports of Soviet units ordered to halt their westward administrative adjustments. Nothing outward enough to appear concessionary, but enough to signal that the Soviet advance, political, territorial, ideological, had met an unexpected barrier. For the first time since the war's end, Stalin stepped backward. Not in fear, not in defeat, but in recognition that Truman had called a bluff Stalin hadn't realized he'd revealed. Power, after all, rests not just in weapons or armies, but in the willingness to face down the man across the table, and Truman had done so with a steadiness Stalin did not anticipate. Back in Washington, Truman did not celebrate. He rarely did. He simply instructed that the United States remain firm, vigilant, present. The world was changing shape. And he knew this moment, this subtle but decisive pause in Soviet ambition, was the hinge on which the next era would turn. A new struggle had begun, one without battlefields or front lines, one fought in shadows and diplomacy, in signals and silences, and though neither man said it aloud, both understood that the peace forged in the aftermath of the greatest war in human history would be fragile, contested, and cold. The world had stepped into a different kind of danger.
The summer air over Germany carried a tension that felt different from war. Tension woven not from gunfire, but from calculation. By August of 1945, the maps spread across Allied tables no longer marked front lines, but borders of influence. Lines of ink replaced lines of fire. Yet the stakes were no less lethal. Every decision in Berlin, Washington, or Moscow could tilt the balance of the world. In the days after Truman quietly confronted Stalin in Potsdam, a strange stillness settled between the Allies. It was the stillness of men listening for a move the other had not yet made. American officers noticed it in the way Soviet patrols watched them from across the Elbe, their expressions unreadable. British envoys sensed it in negotiations that suddenly carried a brittle politeness. And in Moscow, silence itself became a message department's waiting for Stalin to speak, to confirm whether the push westward would continue or halt. Stalin was furious, but he buried it deep. He had never expected Truman to challenge him so directly. Roosevelt had been slower to confront, more patient, more willing to believe in cooperation. But Truman, with his small-town directness and unexpected steel, had upset assumptions that Stalin had held for months. The Soviet leader had misread him, and misreading an opponent was the one error Stalin could not forgive in himself. For 3 nights after the confrontation, Stalin walked the long corridors of the Kremlin alone, reviewing reports delivered in sealed envelopes. He examined troop dispositions in Poland, Romania, and Hungary. He studied intelligence estimates of American production capabilities, and he reread translated fragments of Truman's remarks, trying to locate the source of the president's confidence. He knew the Americans were building something colossal, a weapon of unusual power, but he did not yet know its shape, its purpose, or its implications. What troubled him was not the bomb itself, but the quiet tone Truman had used when he hinted at its existence. Stalin understood tone. Tone revealed what men believed they could carry out in the villages and cities occupied by the Red Army. A more subtle shift appeared. Soviet field commanders received new orders: avoid unnecessary clashes with British or American units. Be firm, but not provocative. Secure Soviet interests, but do not expand them without direct authorization. It was the closest Stalin came to admitting uncertainty, thousands of miles away. In Washington, Truman sensed the opening. His advisors urged caution, reminding him that the Soviets were still exhausted, yet dangerous, wounded, but influential. But Truman had learned something in the weeks since. Roosevelt's death, leadership was not a matter of waiting for clarity. Leadership meant deciding while the fog still covered the horizon, and the horizon was clouded by more than diplomacy, American. Reconnaissance planes over Eastern Europe reported long columns of Soviet transport trucks moving eastward with machinery, blueprints, and personnel raw material for whatever industrial resurgence Stalin had planned. The Soviets dismantled factories brick by brick, shipping them back to Russia as reparations. They disassembled entire rail yards. They emptied laboratories. Every object that could rebuild the Soviet Union vanished into convoys that rolled through the night. Truman feared that if Stalin was allowed to consolidate too much power, the continent America had just bled to save would slide into a different kind of darkness. Not fascism, something colder, more methodical. Another report arrived in late August. Soviet forces in northern Iran were refusing to withdraw, contrary to the promises made during the war. It was a distant front, a quiet corner of the world, but Truman understood the pattern. The Soviets were testing boundaries not through open aggression, but through incremental steps, like a glacier pushing forward grain by grain until the landscape had changed beyond recognition. The moment Truman learned this, he made a decision that would define the next century. He summoned his Joint Chiefs and his senior diplomats to the Oval Office. No public speeches, no declarations, just a quiet directive. The United States would no longer interpret Soviet moves as negotiation. They would interpret them as intent, and intent required response. Truman ordered the rapid mobilization of resources to Europe, not for war, but for presence. Reinforced garrisons, renewed support to Allied governments, intelligence operations expanded discreetly. He wanted Stalin to understand that America was not stepping back. It was stepping forward, but Truman's greatest advantage was one Stalin had yet to witness with his own eyes. In early September, a sealed diplomatic cable reached Moscow. It was concise, almost cold in tone. Attached were reports, heavily summarized, a single event that had taken place over the deserts of New Mexico months earlier, the detonation of the first atomic bomb. Truman had not revealed the details in Potsdam. It had not been necessary. His confidence had carried its own message. But now the Soviets saw the truth spelled out in stark, technical language. A weapon whose blast could erase a city core in seconds, whose heat could fuse sand into glass, whose shockwave could flatten miles of structures as if the earth itself had exhaled. Stalin read it alone in his study, his face illuminated by the lamp's pale glow. He made no sound when he reached the line estimating the bomb's yield. He simply inhaled once a deep, steady breath, exhaled through his nose. He did not summon his advisors immediately. He did not react outwardly at all, but inside, something shifted. This was the weapon whose existence had infused Truman with such calm certainty. This was the shadow behind his words. Stalin was not afraid of destruction. He had waded through destruction for decades, but he feared disadvantage. He feared a world where the balance of terror rested entirely in someone else's hands. He feared falling behind. The atomic bomb was not merely a threat. It was a deadline within hours. Stalin issued orders that would transform the Soviet Union, orders to accelerate scientific research, to recruit German physicists, to reorganize laboratories under tight security. He demanded results, not in years, but months. He told Beria, the head of the NKVD, that failure was not an option. And when Beria asked what resources were required, Stalin answered with a single word: everything. Yet, even as he prepared for a nuclear future, Stalin understood the present. And in the present, the United States possessed something the Soviet Union did not leverage for now. He had no choice but to slow his advance, to play for time, to mask ambition behind diplomacy. The Cold War had not yet taken its name, but its logic had already begun to spread through every decision he made. In Berlin, Soviet officers softened their tone. Checkpoints grew less confrontational. Meetings that had stalled suddenly restarted. It was not cooperation. It was calculation. Truman recognized the shift immediately, but he did not relax. He knew Stalin's retreat was tactical, not permanent. A quiet retreat is still a maneuver in a rare, private moment. Truman stood at a shattered window frame inside the former German chancellery during a tour of occupied Berlin. Wind carried the scent of dust and lingering smoke across the ruins. He looked out over the crumbled city streets like veins exposed. Its buildings split open to reveal rooms where lives had once unfolded quietly, normally, before the world collapsed. Stalin had once expected to dominate all of this, to mold Europe with the pressure of fear. But now, that pressure had found resistance. The American president rested his hand on the stone sill. The debris beneath his fingers crumbled softly. Weak material, fragile, like the peace forming around it. He knew the confrontation was not over. It had only begun. And every move from this point forward, every policy, every alliance, every unspoken signal would determine whether Europe lived under freedom, tyranny, or the quiet dread of an unending standoff. As Truman turned away from the window, one thought remained fixed in his mind. Stalin had backed down once, but he would not back down forever. The next move, inevitably, would be his.
The cold months that followed settled over Europe like a second winter, one made not of snow but of uncertainty. The guns were silent, but the world behaved as if it were learning to walk again after a long and violent sleep. Outwardly, peace had returned. But beneath every treaty signing, every reconstruction plan, every handshake on the steps of a parliament trying to rise from rubble, ran a deeper current, a nervous calculation of who would shape the future. For Harry Truman, the question was never abstract. He felt it in every briefing spread across his desk, every late-night call from Berlin or London, every intelligence report hinting at Soviet movements dressed as local reorganizations. He had inherited a world raw from fire, but its wounds had not scabbed over. They were open, vulnerable, and easily infected by ambition. And no one understood ambition like Joseph Stalin, from the Kremlin. Stalin watched the West's reconstruction efforts with growing irritation. He saw American aid pouring into France, Italy, and Greece, food equipment, credits, engineers. He saw British efforts to stabilize fractured governments from Norway to the Balkans. And he saw something more dangerous than any weapon, a Western alliance beginning to take shape. At first, it was barely noticeably committee here, a joint reconstruction board there, but soon the pattern was undeniable. The United States and Western Europe were moving closer, pulled by shared necessity and a common fear. Stalin had counted on exhaustion to break them apart. Instead, it tied them together. This was not what he had expected when he faced Truman months earlier. He had assumed the Americans would retreat home after victory, leaving Europe to its natural post-war order. But Truman had anchored the United States to the continent with quiet determination. And so, Stalin began probing again. In the early months of 1946, Eastern Europe changed tone. Local leaders aligned with Moscow rose to prominence through elections that looked free but were shaped carefully behind the scenes. Opposition candidates vanished. Newspapers were shuttered. And across cities once vibrant with debate, an unfamiliar stillness settled. Truman watched each move with growing clarity. Stalin was not advancing through armies now. He was advancing through silence. The silence of intimidation. Of men afraid to speak. Of governments afraid to resist. The American president knew that the world was shifting into something new, something undefined. Not war, but certainly not peace. A twilight zone between the two, thick with suspicion. For the first time, Truman recognized that the confrontation between him and Stalin was no longer about territory. It was about the rules that would govern the century. The decisive moment arrived in a place far from the seats of power, a small college in Missouri, where Truman invited Winston Churchill to speak. The war hero, now out of office, stepped onto the stage and uttered a sentence that cut through the world like a blade. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind the scenes, Churchill and Truman had spoken at length. Their conversation was not about glory or nostalgia. It was about responsibility. Truman needed a voice capable of naming the danger clearly, and Churchill, older, unbound by office, and still revered, delivered it with the weight of experience. Stalin read the speech within hours. His reaction was volcanic but controlled. He accused Churchill of warmongering, denounced the Western press, tightened his grip on Eastern Europe, and declared that the Soviet Union desired only security. But security, to Stalin, meant dominance. And dominance required confrontation. The months that followed became a chessboard in motion. In Greece, Stalin backed communist insurgents, testing Western resolve. In Iran, he refused to withdraw Soviet troops until intense pressure forced his hand. In Berlin, Soviet officials slowed Allied access routes, delaying trains, blocking shipments, asserting that every square mile of the city was subject to Soviet interpretation. The world held its breath. At the center of all of it were two men, defined not by personal animosity, but by incompatible visions of the future. Truman believed stability came from choice, nations choosing their governance freely, economies choosing their direction, people choosing their fate. Stalin believed stability came from control, fear, loyalty, and obedience woven into a single unbreakable rope. Their struggle became global without either ever firing a shot at the other. In Washington, Truman convened late-night meetings that stretched past midnight. Advisors debated how far America should go, how much responsibility it could carry. Europe was hungry, cold, and fractured. Entire regions faced collapse. Communist parties gained strength in the chaos. Many feared Stalin would win by default, by simply waiting for the West to run out of energy, but Truman refused to surrender the continent to despair. In 1947, he made the boldest decision of his presidency. He stood before Congress and declared that the United States would support any nation resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. It became known as the Truman Doctrine, but it was more than a policy. It was the moment the United States accepted the burden of defending a fragile peace. Stalin watched this announcement with a long, unreadable stare. The Americans had declared themselves the guardians of the post-war world. It was audacious, dangerous, and effective. Truman's next move was even more striking. The Marshall Plan, massive, unprecedented, generous. Billions of dollars offered to rebuild Europe, with no expectation except stability. Stalin immediately ordered Eastern European governments to reject it, fearing minds could be won by prosperity where intimidation had failed. He was not wrong. Western Europe surged forward. Economies revived, cities rebuilt, and the idea of freedom, real functioning, tangible, began to take hold again. The Soviet leader tightened his fist further. In Czechoslovakia, the last democracy in the East was crushed in a swift, ruthless coup. Western leaders reacted with shock. Truman reacted with resolve. He understood the pattern now. Every time the Soviets advanced, he would push back quietly, firmly, without theatrics. But the true test of wills came in Berlin, in 1948. Stalin made his boldest move since Potsdam. He ordered the blockade of all land routes into West Berlin, cutting off food, fuel, and medicine to over 2 million civilians. It was a precise, calculated act of coercion. Either the West abandoned Berlin, or the city would starve. Truman knew the implications immediately. If the Allies surrendered Berlin, Europe would interpret it as the crack that confirmed Stalin's inevitability. The Soviets would win through pressure, not war. And everything the United States had done since 1945 would unravel. Advisors urged negotiation, compromise, even withdrawal. Truman refused. Instead, he approved an operation most considered impossible, flying every ounce of food, coal, equipment, and medicine into a city surrounded by hostile territory. American and British pilots flew through fog, snow, storms, and Soviet intimidation to keep Berlin alive, landing every few minutes, day and night. The searchlights that ringed the city carved the sky open like scalpels, probing each aircraft that descended through the darkness. The Soviets tried to intimidate the pilots, buzzing flights, shining lights into cockpits, but the planes kept coming. One night, standing outside the White House, Truman looked up at the sky as if he could see those distant aircraft crossing the European night. The hum was only in his imagination, yet he felt it steady, resilient. Answering a challenge that had begun the night he called Stalin's bluff, for 11 months, the airlift continued. Not once did Truman waver. Not once did Stalin shoot down a plane. He knew that a single spark could ignite a war neither side wanted. And at last, quietly, without fanfare, Stalin lifted the blockade. Truman had not just held a city, he had held the line. In the years that followed, the world settled into the long, tense standoff that would define a generation. Alliances formed, nations rebuilt. The shadow of the atomic bomb lengthened across every negotiation and every crisis. Truman and Stalin would never meet again. But their confrontation shaped the boundaries of the age. Stalin never forgot the moment Truman defied him at Potsdam. He never forgot the pause he was forced to make, the retreat he could never admit. In a life built on power, it was one of the few moments he had been checked not by an army. Not by fear, but by conviction. And Truman. He carried the weight of that stand quietly, without celebration. He had begun as a man unsure of his place, thrust unexpectedly into the role of leader during the darkest chapter in modern history. But in choosing to confront Stalin early, firmly, and without bravado, he set the tone for the world that followed. In the end, the great showdown between them was not a single moment but a long, intricate duel fought through silence, strategy, and the steady pressure of two visions colliding. And when history looks back at the fragile peace that held through the decades, it sees the imprint of a decision made in a modest conference room in Potsdam the moment Truman called Stalin's bluff. And Stalin, for the first time, stepped back. The world that emerged was imperfect, tense, divided. But it was not conquered. And that, in the end, was the legacy of the man who refused to yield when the future trembled before him.